Alex Alben, and we're in another episode of the AI Forum podcast. We invite experts in the field of AI and relevant subspecialties to chat about the impact of artificial intelligence and related technology on society and the economy and technology. And we're really happy to have a special guest today. I will have Patrick Ip introduce him. Patrick.
Thank you, Alex. It's a special day. I'm glad to have a kind of an old friend. Colby Hawker and I have been friends at Google nearly a decade. Colby has been at Google for the last 10 years, where he's currently a natural language product manager for both Palm and Gemini. He also teaches at Stanford Continuing Studies, where he teaches a course in making critical bets. He went to undergrad at BYU and also has a master's from Cornell and a master's in engineering. And he also regularly publishes and writes for Google, writing on NLP and large language models. So Colby, thanks so much for joining us today. I'll give you a little chance to share anything more on your background.
Yeah, pleasure is mine. I think you captured most of the key points there. So excited to talk a little bit more.
Yeah, I know, and kind of just teeing things up here, one of the first questions we wanted to kind of go into was looking at the difference between kind of Web 2.0 and LLMs and what you think how they differ in their approach to privacy.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, first of all. So Web 2.0, we can think of it as the era of social media and content creation, mass content creation. I'm a user, go to Facebook or Instagram. I upload my photos. I create my posts. And I am basically sharing a little bit about me, which is my cost, in order to derive some value, which is being able to connect with my friends, being able to share more about my life and learn a little bit more about theirs, and stay connected. In this era, the primary currency has been advertising, and with advertising, what's really required is some piece of personal information, whether it's an identifier about the person, so you can target them with ads, or something about the browser. But you need some sort of personal information for relevant advertising. And for generative AI, for this era that we're in, these AI models, they don't need personally identifiable information. They take a massive amount of information from the web in aggregate, and they're using this to learn patterns and make predictions. And that's at the primary core of what AI does. It's making predictions. And so what's interesting here is the approach to privacy is quite different, because you're able to de-identify a lot of the data that's used in LLMs, and it opens the door to new privacy techniques like differential privacy, which to the audience here, this is basically adding random noise to the data that's being ingested, so that the model itself cannot go back and completely understand identifying information about the data. And so I do think the approach is quite different. Now, the trade-off is also a little bit different as well, because when you're going in, from a consumer standpoint, when you're giving some of your information to, say, social media sites, who you're giving your information to, right? But for AI models that are now sharing a massive amount of information that they're taking or scraping from the web, you don't always know, when your information is being used. And so there's a little bit of trade-off here. And that's why I thought it was a really interesting question.
Colby, this is a great area to start our discussion regarding the business model behind the technology. And I really like the observation that, in a way, the natural language model is more anonymous, at least starting out, for the user and the participant. And I think that's important for users to understand. Like many new technologies, there seems to be a lot of fear around the use of the technology with regard to personal information. I'll give you one use case, but I think you can probably give us a few more. When attorneys are using ChatGPT or Bard or these other systems and they upload documents, their fear is that the personal information of their clients is going to be absorbed by the model and somehow reused and somehow identified. Could you speak to that scenario a little bit?
Yeah, and so this is the other. So there's a couple pillars here. One is the data that's being used in training these massive models, and the other is actually using these models to make predictions or derive some sort of value. And so the vendors who are hosting these models are processing this information, and how that data is used, how it's stored, of course, really matters. And this comes down to business model, and every company has their own approach to making trade-offs with privacy. And I will say that most hyperscalers that I know of, and when I say hyperscalers, I mean these big tech companies, typically follow very rigorous protocols, take privacy very seriously. But every company does have a different approach on are they retaining the information that's processed, or is the processing stateless? Is it a stateless API, meaning the information is not recorded on the servers after the information is processed? And so that's very important, I think, for users to understand, and especially for companies or enterprises who are using these large language models or AI services to understand what exactly is happening with that data.
Well, is the Google model a stateless API?
Yeah. So it depends on the service, but we do focus a lot on stateless services.
Okay. And what are the other privacy concerns that you have to answer frequently?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot in the realm of privacy, because privacy is collection of data, the storing of data, the processing of data. And so these concerns are very different at a consumer level. So someone who is maybe using Bard versus someone who's using large foundation models, like with OpenAI's ChatGPT, or some of Google's models. And so for the enterprise, it's exactly like you stated, Alex. A lot of these large language models cater to big investment banks or other companies that are processing very sensitive information. And so the concern that comes up is, where's my data being stored? So does it need to be stored in Europe? Does it need to be stored in Australia? Do they require, customer managed encryption keys? What level of encryption? Who can access this information? So when there's debugging or troubleshooting that needs to take place, who can access this? And so really, I think the commonality between consumer and enterprise use cases is transparency, knowing where this information is going.
And maybe the ability to correct or delete the information, is that offered?
Exactly that. And the ability to go back and request that the information is wiped or deleted. And that's something that also, comes up quite a bit.
I was going to ask maybe like a more sociological question. I think in Web 2.0, we've grown accustomed to trading our privacy for access to, services like Google or Facebook. And it seems there's the Web 3.0 era, but we might actually be taking kind of a detour to this more AI, LLM type of business model, where there's actual subscription money being transferred. It's not your identifiable information. How do you think consumer psychology will change there? Where if there's a paywall now for every service, maybe like basic services, the future Google search, maybe in order to access it, you have to pay for it. Do you have any thoughts on like how the general public should think about these kind of new emerging business models and kind of this new web? What's kind of your guidance and thoughts there?
Yeah, I think it's anyone's guess at this point of how this will be received in the future. And I think a lot of what shapes this is, how do journalists, talk about developments in AI? How do they talk about issues in AI? And that will help dictate, what are consumers willing to give up, whether that's monetary or maybe it's some level of privacy.
When you look at the overall business world, Colby, what do you think the most obvious applications are going to be for organizational improvement? Say, whether it's manufacturing or professional services, and are you seeing those things occurring already with the use of these large foundational models?
Yeah, it was really interesting. So rewind a year and a half, I started as a PM lead for large language models before the era of ChatGPT. And at the time, we were exploring different use cases with different customers. And when everything started accelerating, when OpenAI released ChatGPT, and then we subsequently released Palm, and every other company released their own model, a lot of organizations were in a hurry to find that killer use case, that killer application. And the interesting thing was, like, all of last year, so all of 2023, very, very few organizations had managed large language models in production. There were a lot of toy use cases, there were a lot of experimental use cases, but it wasn't until the last, I would say, 4 to 6 months, so very tail end of last year, where we started seeing real use cases with significant economic value. And in terms of the sectors where we've kind of seen, where I've seen the most disruption, is one, professional services, as you mentioned, being able to process and understand information at scale, whether that be documents. You look at insurance companies, financial institutions, taking very laborious tasks and being able to automate this, having large language models being able to interpret, and generalize information so well, this has become much more effective than using traditional AI models that we had 2, 3, 4 years ago. And so companies that were otherwise hesitant are now putting these models in production. So professional services, customer service is an obvious one. You look at Klarna. Klarna is a Swedish fintech company, and over the last week, they made a press release that they actually were able to cut down 700 customer service employees because their customer service chatbot was working so well. And in terms of bottom line, they're forecasting $40 million in net new profitability for 2024, which is pretty astounding. And so now is where more and more economic value is being realized. And then you look at life sciences, healthcare, and finance. Definitely, that's where we've seen a lot of traction, a lot of applications going live.
We're speaking with Colby Hawker of Google on the AI Forum podcast. Patrick, did you have a question in another area?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things, and I think for the general public too, is this kind of fear that people are losing their jobs and there's some displacement. Yeah. What do you think is generative AI a net positive for society? How do people kind of reshift their job functions in this kind of new world?
Yeah, so I think a very large misconception is that AI is going to completely replace certain types of jobs, which is not necessarily correct. I think most types of AI, including generative AI, is going to serve as a collaborator to human work. And so what this is going to do is it's going to automate a lot of the monotonous or laborious tasks. And then the people working in those jobs are going to be freed up to do more creative work and be able to upskill in the same field, really. And so I think it is a net positive impact. It's just going to be a shift. And it will take some getting used to. And I do have friends who are working in fields where, they're worried about, more automation with AI and what are they going to do? What's the longevity and security of their career? But I think most are starting to realize, this is actually a great opportunity because they can simply make a pivot and do more interesting work. And I don't know if you've noticed that as well from folks that you've talked to, but that seems to be, the picture is coming in a little bit sharper now, whereas even a couple of years ago, I think there was a little bit more fear.
We're definitely seeing that in the legal tech industry with respect to management of documents and document production, which tasks that used to take 10 hours can be done in 5 minutes. And that does free up attorneys, and I think is going to change, as you say, the role of the attorney in the firm. Another legal area, would be this concern about intellectual property rights and plagiarism. I think the public has a conception that the large language models are simply storing every photo and every painting known to mankind in some huge library. Maybe you can educate us a little bit on how these models actually work, because I think that might allay some of the fears when you hear that they are making copies or plagiarizing.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think a lot of the fear comes from just the lack of education on how AI actually works. Where are your assets being stored? What is AI actually doing with your information? Right, and so at the heart, any AA model is just making predictions. And if you've ever played the game, Mad Libs before, this is a fun game where basically you're shouting out words that are top of mind to you, right? And that's the way AI works is what word comes next in some given pattern, and so it'll take a prompt, and a prompt could be summarize this information for me. And because of all of the information that I digested, it's able to understand, what is the prompt actually asking. And so therefore I need to take this information that was given to me and summarize it. And so it's going to do one word after the other and simply output these, what we call tokens, and start forming coherent sentences that are in line with the instruction of this given prompt. And so in simplified terms, I mean, this is glorified statistics. This is a prediction model. And once information is processed, once it's done making this prediction, there's no need for this information for this AI to be able to continue to do its job. Now, the difference here is, some organizations may suggest that they are actually going to use that data for further training, but they have the obligation to disclose this. And so I think diving a little bit deeper and understanding, how this works and what's being done with the asset and what need AI has for those assets, or when does it not need it anymore, I think is important to learn. But I think the, with this trend of multimodality, and what I mean by that is the ability for these generative models to take multiple forms of input, whether this is text, this is imagery, this is videos, and then comprehend all this all at once. I think this raises some fears as well, because now the assets or the multimedia assets that you're uploading are richer and may reveal more information. And so I think it's not surprising that there's a little bit more angst behind this, but understanding where the information is stored, how long is it stored for, is also very imperative as well.
Interesting. When you talk about, let's say, the future of AI over the next few years, do you think that it's going to continue to be an integral part of tech companies? Is it just such a productivity enhancer that it's going to lift our entire sector and economy?
Yeah, I think so. I think we're actually just scratching the surface of where AI is going, and I use the analogy kind of coming into focus. It was very opaque even 12, 16 months ago, but it's becoming clearer of what is the future of AI, at least looking the next 2 to 4 years out. Where could this go? And so we're starting to see some of those golden applications, like I referenced earlier. But I think there's a lot of progress in a couple of areas. One is safeguards and privacy. So removing fear, making helping organizations get to production by removing some of those stumbling blocks, and then allowing end users of AI to feel more at ease, collaborating with AI and using it in their daily lives. So I think that's one area. And two is, specifically speaking to the progression of language models, the ability to enhance the quality of information that's being returned in LLMs. As we all know, large models of any sort can hallucinate. They can get information wrong. But there's lots of new approaches and techniques that are emerging. One of them being, RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation, basically connecting an LLM, a large language model, to a database or a ground truth information, and being able to have these large models fact check against themselves and cite where this information is coming from. And that's kind of the holy grail. And that's not true just for language, but also for imagery and videos and other types of large models as well. And so I think the future is still very bright. You're removing stumbling blocks. You're enhancing the quality of information that's coming to you, which is a big asset. Yeah. And I personally think, one of the biggest values of AI is building on previous information. With large models that have digested the world's information and piggybacking off of Web 2.0, which is all this content that's been generated on the internet. I have all these Reddit forums and social media posts. These models learn how people interact with each other, and also learn about human progression, research articles. And it's really cool because you can go back in, you have medical researchers, you have a lot of scientists who are now using large language models to build on previous research, where they don't have to go and sift through all these previous papers. They can augment it. They can use it to augment their own creativity. And so this augmentation of current human knowledge is a big deal. And so more forward looking, I think that's only going to get better.
I think for a lot of the Gen AI products, we hear about advancements in productivity or medical. We had a guest on, a couple of weeks ago who talked about advancements in the not-for-profit space, some of these kind of unsolved problems that now with these new tools, we can actually have the bandwidth to go solve them. Do you have any perspective on maybe things that you feel like Gen AI, it's more difficult for them to solve or for them to touch? Like what are kind of the last milestones or last things that you think Gen AI will get to?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of use cases that are still very nascent, and where generative AI doesn't quite get right. I think one of those areas where there's potential for, and I keep coming back to killer applications, is around code generation. Code generation is getting so close. You can automate a lot of functions. You can automate very basic website creation. So you can ask it to create the HTML and some basic JavaScript code for you. But where it's lacking is creating some of these larger components to web applications or more sophisticated products. Take an entire GitHub repo and be able to automate a lot of those coding processes. I think we're not quite there yet, because it doesn't always get the code right. And I think we'll eventually get there. So I think that's one area. And I think the other area is personalized medicine. So healthcare, actually a lot of areas of healthcare. And right now, data quality, and I'm speaking more broadly here. I'm not speaking on behalf of Google by any means. Broadly speaking, there's still a lot of obstacles in healthcare and in terms of the reliability of information. Can you rely on it, and how much can it understand from medical knowledge? Now, you have MedPalm, you have a lot of these advancements, and we're going somewhere, but it's still very nascent. And so I think we're still, some time away from having that killer application.
We're talking with Colby Hawker of Google, and Patrick and I have been working a little bit in the education field, and I know that you're involved at Stanford, as I have been on the Stanford Law and Tech Advisory Board. When you look at education and advancements, do you see some net positives happening already in that field, aside from students generating their term papers with the various applicable tools?
Yeah. So I think the commercial applications, we still are scratching the surface in education, and I wish there'd be more investment in that space, specifically AI education, because I think there's tremendous impact. The way that students learn is fundamentally evolving. It's changing, and with AI, you now have the capability of catering knowledge to individual needs, individual learning styles and preferences. And I think that's amazing. And even for me, when I am either preparing to teach a course, I teach multiple courses, or when I'm just trying to catch up on latest trends of generative AI or large language models, there's papers going out, every day. I need to stay on top of this information, but I don't have time to go and read through every paper. I want to be able to augment this information for my use case, for what I'm using this for. And so a bad use case is, taking a bunch of information in an educational context and pawning it off as your own work, or doing it without any sort of oversight.
I would never suggest that Stanford students would do that.
I would never suggest this.
Okay.
But it has the ability to augment your own understanding and comprehend quicker, and be able to take that information, incorporate it into your own work. And I think that's a really cool capability.
Patrick, we probably have time for one or two more questions with Colby.
Yeah, we a swath of our audience are students, and I'm curious, if you had to go back to school knowing everything that you know today, would you change what you learned, or what would you kind of focus on given today's evolving landscape?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I honestly haven't given it much thought. And I think if I were to go back, I think it's always important in any educational context to learn the building blocks of your field, because even when I was in graduate school, they would tell us, from an engineering perspective, what you're learning today is likely going to be outdated 2 or 3 years from now. And so we want to teach you how to learn better and equip you with the right tools to accelerate your learning 5 or 6 years down the road. And so being able to take apart, what is static information today versus what are the dynamic tools that are likely going to, in some shape or form, going to exist or live on in some evolved form tomorrow or 5 years from now. How do you learn those tools? And then how do you change the way you learn to be able to, again, comprehend and synthesize information quicker? And so I think learning the right tools, learning how to do better research quicker, I think are some of the skills that I'd go back and try to do a little refresher on.
Colby, one of the specific projects I think you worked on are identity cards using AI. Can you talk a little bit about that, Document AI?
Yeah, so several years ago, I worked on a couple of projects in document. We call it document AI, which is a solution for businesses to be able to better understand their documents. And these documents are, contain very ambiguous information to computers, because you have a document and then you have potentially different images or charts in these documents, and you have unstructured text that could be anywhere. And so what we were doing is basically, training machines to be able to understand, patterns in a lot of these types of documents, where this information was likely to be found, whether these were identification cards like passports or driver's licenses or something else. And you have to teach these models to be able to interpret spatial information coming from the document, linguistic cues from the documents, and other visual cues on the document as well. And so it was a very interesting project. And ultimately the goal was to help with automation and help, companies, big banks, government organizations to process information quicker.
I mean, maybe when you think about it, one of the great achievements already of these language models is they've helped us interpret unstructured data. We have so much, the world is a world of unstructured data, and actually just bringing structure to it enables you to utilize all of the wealth of information and intelligence there in a way that's accessible to anybody who has access.
Exactly. And for the last several years, I've worked on language models, and, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, the goal of natural language models was to understand ambiguous information and make sense of it, because it's really hard to do. And even now with generative capabilities, so now it's understanding these documents and now generating something new, it's still very relevant, because oftentimes some of the organizations that we work with will simply generate a structured view of that document, whether it's a table, an extracting key piece of information, name of people that are represented on the document, different dates, different locations. And then this structured view can basically be uploaded to some database and shared with the broader organization or other workers who are involved in various capacities.
Right. Well, on that note, I want to thank you for your time speaking with the AI Forum podcast. Patrick, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, Colby, this was great. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective, and hopefully we'll have you on again.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.